Right then, friends, we have a very interesting talk today by Jeffery, and it is on Canon Collins of Christian Action, and as Jeffery said, my journey within So, Jeffery, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, friends. Just a few bits of methodology. Not everybody's got muted at the moment, but some people might need to be unmuted. The other thing is I want to do some share screen a bit. I can see a green button, so I'm hoping that will work satisfactorily, successfully when I get to it. And if that's the case, I'll get started. Thank you for everyone for coming, and I hope the picture is okay. It's I tried to adjust the louvres here to make myself visible, and I've got a dark pullover on, so a lot of me is not visible, but hopefully the important bits are. So I'm going to talk about Christian Action, and which is an organization. And I'll explain more in a moment. Canon Collins, who was a canon at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And I've got a few exhibits to share screen, mainly book covers to illustrate the points. So I'll now start my talk. Firstly, in introductory pieces. Christian Action was founded in 1946 by John Collins, soon to become a canon at St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, I want to now show, share screen, and I'm hoping to, sorry about this, I thought it was better to try this now, not in mid-flow. The dilemma is I can't now click on the screen. Just a minute. Oh, here we are. Now, can you see a book cover and a picture of Canon Collins? And the book is called Faith Under Fire.
Not yet.
Oh.
No.
You need to,
right.
You need to click on share screen, and then
yeah, I thought I'd done that.
There you go. Well done.
Right. Okay. So there's a picture. That's a book. That's his autobiography.
You're actually sharing your whole desktop and not just the window with the picture.
Yeah. How do we get around that one?
Well, when you selected something, it gave you options, including desktop and whatever other screens that you have open. So you needed to select the one with just the picture of Canon Collins on it.
Can you see me still?
Yes.
Well, what I'll do, I'll just adjust the.
It's good enough for now.
All right. Well, I'll minimize a few things, so you'll see a bit of green and stuff. Now I'll hope to find another picture very shortly. This is a biography by his wife, Diana Collins. And you can see the Daily Telegraph said, humorous yet moving, beautifully written. And there's a foreword by Bishop Trevor Huddleston. So I'll now go on. Before World War II, John Collins had been Dean of Oriel College, Oxford. In World War II, he had been a chaplain in the RAF. In 1946, upon returning to Oxford, he founded Christian Action to work for reconciliation with Germany.
Jeffrey, I suggest you stop screen sharing for the moment, because we're just looking at your desktop and can't see.
All right, sorry. All right, as a red button, stop share.
There you go.
Thank you. Well, that's good. It's nice to see you. I'll just slightly recap. Before World War II, John Collins had been Dean of Oriel College, Oxford. In World War II, he had been a chaplain in the RAF. In 1946, upon returning to Oxford, he founded Christian Action to work for reconciliation with Germany. As time passed and West Germany was developing satisfactorily to a new constitution, incidentally created by a former Bristol trade unionist, Collins moved the focus to look at the world more widely, since Christianity was more than going to church on Sunday. Along with Christians of other denominations, he set up his organization to epitomize the involved position he thought a committed Christian ought to have. He was appointed as a canon at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1948 by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, an office he held for 33 years. His organization, Christian Action, was interdenominational, including Roman Catholics. As member organizations go, it was radical. Its founding constitution included famous names such as Sir Stafford Cripps, who was Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. But that's how things were done in those days. By the 1960s, Christian Action Council included well-known churchmen from the Methodists, Quakers, and Church of England and other churches. For instance, members included George MacLeod, the founder of the Iona community, Donald Soper, the Methodist minister, socialist and pacifist, John Robinson, Bishop of Woolwich, author of Honest to God, and a witness for the defence in the Lady Chatterley's lover trial of 1960. Also, there was Paul Oestreicher, who was both a Quaker and a Church of England priest, possibly the only Quaker to be a member of the Church of England General Synod. A Quaker, Raymond Andrews, who had been thought of as a successor to John Collins, told me around 2000 that one day in 1942, he had gone to a bank on the High Street in Oxford and opened an account for a new organisation. This was the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief, Oxfam. Going back to Canon Collins, some of what he did went beyond his organisation. For instance, he and the philosopher Bertrand Russell founded CND, and he set up Defence and Aid, which, despite every effort of the South African Bureau of State Security, or BOSS, sent money and support to defend those actively opposing apartheid and their dependents. Now, I've got another book cover to show you coming up. Just getting there. I don't know much about this book, except that the author is Dennis Herbstein, and it's White Lies, Canon Collins and the Secret War Against Apartheid. I could say more as an ancillary thing later on how Canon Collins was at the centre of a project that got lots and lots of money to disadvantaged people in South Africa. I'll now stop screen sharing and move on. So I now got to the 1970s. Around 1970, to me, recently come to Quakers, two organisations seemed to me to epitomise the possible activist standpoints. One was Quakers and the other Christian Action. This was the days of alternatives. Alternatives would, by their example, speak to all and change the world. That was the theory. But there was one crucial difference. CA, like the rest of the world, thought and acted within hierarchical structures. Quakers didn't. By 1970, John Collins was looking for a successor, and as an interim position, chose Colin to be Christian Action's director. It was he who came to hold things together at that time in a more contemporary format. As I saw it, Christian Action was a sort of umbrella for such relatively independent bodies as Homeless in Britain, Radical Alternatives to Prison, the London School of Non-Violence, something called the Theatre Girls Club, and Tent City. I imagine Christian Action held conferences for Christians and had the means to make public statements too. But being at the sharp end, I wasn't involved in those aspects. John Collins would, though, often hit the headlines. For instance, I think he preached the ordination of women from the pulpit of St. Paul's, and that this was on the 1 o'clock news a couple of hours later. However, my source cannot confirm this. One of the projects was the London School of Non-Violence. This was set up in 1969 at the centenary of Gandhi's birth. John Collins, though not a pacifist, invited Satish Kumar to do this together with Colin. Satish had been a Jain monk. He had then walked around the world. When in Moscow, he formed a one-man protest against nuclear weapons outside the Kremlin. Apparently, after a week or more, Mrs. Khrushchev invited him in for tea. After that, he walked to London. So Satish was well prepared to instruct non-violence. The school met in the crypt of St. Martin in the Fields Church, and many influential people accepted invitations to speak there, including such as the economist E.F. Schumacher, author of Small is Beautiful. I should say they met twice a week, I think, there. It was a very comprehensive program of talk and involvement. All aspects of life and existence were discussed at the school, including depletion of world resources. Carbon damaging world climate was not known about in the 1970s. One topic was living in community. Much was said in favour of this, and Collins set up a community of 6, known initially as the Bow Community. When South African black leaders came to talk in the Methodist Central Hall, Westminster, about apartheid, I was one of a number chosen to be a steward. A thoroughgoing pacifist may have doubts about police forces, so this was a first step towards an alternative. We had to stand in the front and keep a look at the large audience, watching out for anyone throwing things at the stage or otherwise misbehaving. We had some advance, and fortunately, nothing bad happened. Christian Action had offices in the City of London, not far from St. Paul's. Colin thought it more appropriate to be based in a more working class location. Heather, one of the Bow community, had come across a half derelict Eastbourne house, a former community centre and East London settlement founded by a public school. So Christian Action Council was persuaded to move its offices from Newgate Street in the city to an open plan office in the ground floor of Eastbourne House in Bethnal Green. The first floor theatre and 4 rooms would become community centre use. The 3rd floor would be converted into 6 small flats for peace workers to live in. These would be for an exchange scheme with Gandhian peace workers from India, getting the feel for life in a London suburb. I'm now going to screen share another item. So just trying to remind myself about that. So this is Eastbourne House. A big place, 4 floors, some very large rooms, including a theatre that would seat 200 people or so. It had been derelict for about 15 years in 1970 and getting worse. Just on the left, you can see part of the vicarage, and on the right, there was a church that was bombed in World War II. So going back to see you all, We are, thank you. Colin and Barnaby hatched the idea of a work camp to restore Eastbourne House, and I was chosen to be its leader. Colin had seen a London Quaker action group run the first open Christmas for rough sleepers in 1971. Something like 200 attended, maybe a third staying for 5 nights. I had been one of the conveners of this arrangement, and if you'd like to know more about it, go to East London-based Quaker Social Action's website, where a colleague of mine asked if I would help him write an article about what happened 50 years ago, and the Open Christmas started, and the idea spread, and quite a number of them happened, and rough sleepers had several nights at Christmas off the streets. Going back to the Eastbourne House work camp, to qualify, you had to be an impecunious backpacker. Christian Action had set up Tent City, a hostel under canvas, conveniently adjacent to football changing rooms and showers on Wormwood Scrubs in West London. So there being no football in the summer, the changing rooms were available, and 8 or 10 marquee tents containing bunk beds were grouped around the changing rooms. So people who were backpacking could stay in London for a very low amount in July and August. Tent City was, of course, named after Martin Luther King's Tent City. Barnaby, the manager there, offered ones whose money had run out, but who seemed capable, opportunity to join the Eastbourne House work camp right across the other side of London in Bethnal Green. In exchange for 6 hours work, 5 days a week, they got accommodation in the enormous rooms on the top floor of Eastbourne House and pocket money. Mostly, these impecunious backpackers came from the white Commonwealth and USA, not the UK. When they arrived, campers were allotted to whatever trade they could offer. We found that around 1 in 10 people had natural aptitudes as plasterers. That is, they could get gypsum plaster onto the wall, it stayed there, and they could work it. Other specialities were carpenters, decorators, and electricians. Before all that, however, we fixed the roof, which entailed cutting out decayed timbers, treating the rest, and getting a specialist to replace damaged asphalt. I wrote an article for the Christian Action Journal saying, we decided not to rent anyone to kill the fungus. We taught ourselves what chemicals to use. That's a pun on rent a kill. One volunteer was English and a dropout from Cambridge. He offered to design a new heating system, so we bought him a textbook. A few months later, being very clever, he had self-taught himself heating engineering and designed a system using the new type of wall-mounted gas-fired boiler. 4 or 5 campers learnt to be plumbers to install the system, threading steel pipes and soldering copper pipe joints. Eventually, we all stood in the boiler room and switched on. A soft-sounding puff indicated first one, then in each of the other boilers firing. When the gas company came to approve, they were amazed and certified it. Kate was sent from Newgate Street to be my secretary, but she quickly decided to learn plumbing, and though small in stature, installed the waste pipe system, occasionally typing something for me. Each Friday it was payday. We sent 2 people to the bank in the city for the money. This worked well, till one day, the young Canadian woman phoned to say the chap sent with her had run off with the money. I phoned Colin, and we decided to close the work camp for the day and send groups of 3 to each mainline railway station to see if they recognised anybody. 2 hours later, the group from St Pancras phoned to say that they had found him. They recognised a chap called JC. They had put him in a telephone box on the Gray's Inn Road and were holding the door shut. What should they do then? Now that we had done the police's work for them, we called them, and JC was arrested, though had already spent half the money on new clothes. I think he was on it looking for a train to Nottingham. In due course, he was in court, and Frida, the Secretary of Christian Action, was in court being criticised for not looking after money donated to a charity. It transpired that JC, aged 23, had spent a lot of time in prison already for petty thieving, following life in an orphanage. We asked him not to be sent back to prison, and we would give him a job. We also gave him a home in the community where I lived, and he kept out of prison for some time. Indeed, he kept out of prison for the rest of his life, except for one period in Ford Open prison after he'd gone back to stealing cars. From time to time, I still see him and send him money twice a year, amounts that relate to his age in years. Then it all stopped. A tragedy intervened. The director moved on. But after 2 years, the renovation was largely complete. It was near the London Buddhist Centre, who were in an old fire station, which I thought too awkward to get involved with. They and other radical people, including therapists of various sorts, started to use the rooms in Eastbourne House. All the work campus had dissipated to different parts of the white world. I was one of Christian Action's main people by then. Canon Collins invited me to a sherry at his home, one of the larger Canon's houses at Amen Court, just around the corner from St. Paul's. I'm not sure I had drunk sherry before. In some ways, I was still rather naive, though I was by then 27. 2 years before, I had effectively been invited to become leader of what is now Quaker Social Action, but I turned it down because I found Christian Action's work more interesting. Now I turned down high office in Christian Action because I was a Quaker. Instead, I went on a bus to Greece for a month. This was tricky because I'd only been paid the same as the rest of the people, pocket money, so I couldn't afford to go to Greece. So I had to ask through an intermediary, the Council of Christian Action, if they'd give me 500 quid, and they agreed to. So I got a bus to Greece, and it took 3 nights, one of which was in a bed. The other 2 nights were on the bus. After that, I signed on as a cooperative building worker, but soon got a job at the National Building Agency doing innovative work on the nation's housing stock. I lived in some friends' community in Bethnal Green with my wife Heather, which was inspired and assisted by all this with Christian Action. And I lived there for 17 years. So there we are, friends. In a rather large nutshell, do ask any questions, I guess. Ray, is that the next part of the proceedings? Thank you, I see some.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was an involved and I would say interesting life experience. So our friends, questions and comments. Hattie.
You know me, I ask stupid questions. Anyway, I would say, Jeffrey, that you concertinaed your life, especially towards the end. So this, so that, so the other, and here I am now. I think a lot must have happened since that sort of, well, middle age. I mean, anyhow, you must have some thoughts about the benefit of your younger life experience on what you get up to now.
Well, yes, Hattie. I mean, it was a sort of gap year that became about 4 years, and it was fascinating. It was exciting times, really. I'd just become a chartered civil engineer. I'd done satisfied the institution with exams. Nowadays, you do that with a degree, but in those days, you took examinations. And I'd got a job at a very important consulting engineers who did water scheme designs, including the largest dam in Pakistan, for example. Anyway, I took time off to do the first open Christmas, and then I took more time off to organise an open Easter, and then properly organise a second open Christmas, and then those are things that I've described ensued, really.
Wow.
After all this, at the National Building Agency, I had a job back as an engineer, and I quite liked it. And it was just 9 to 5. My life had not been 9 to 5 for a long time, so 9 to 5 meant I could go home and do something else.
Both useful. Working on the housing stock and being at home.
Yes.
Can you imagine any of our today Anglican community developing something so radical?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Anglican community, although I know somebody who was a woman who was a dean of a cathedral, so I do know them a little bit. In fact, when I went to investigate tour, I met a notable radical Labour MP and a rather notorious Conservative MP. That was at the cathedral in East Anglia, but this is a diversion. Anyway, they're the sort of current radical Anglicans. And as far as I make out, the Bishop of Bristol is pretty radical. This lady who's the Bishop of Bristol.
Who's the Bishop of Bristol now?
Ah, well, you'll have to get someone else to answer that.
Oh, so which Bishop of Bristol are you speaking of as radical?
Well, the current Bishop of Bristol, I believe, is a woman, and I believe she's been a bit involved in some of the actions on the green outside the cathedral. I think David Mert's been working with her quite a bit, but I can't say much about that at all, I'm afraid. Of course, the Christian church is somewhat smaller than it was. I mean, the times have changed a lot. Is the world very impressed if the Archbishop of Canterbury says something? They jolly well were in those days, but I'm not too much sure how impressed they are by when the Archbishop of Canterbury speaks now. And for example, when I met John Robinson, who'd written a book called Honest to God. I'm not sure how many people here have come across that book. It was very famous in 1970 and 1980. I looked up a lot of the background I knew, plus a bit of it was from the books. And I looked up in the Dictionary of National Biography as well, where you can get quite a bit on notable people. And I learned a bit about John Collins from that. John Robinson, of course, had been, that's where I learned that John Robinson had been a witness in defense of Penguin Books in 1960, who had been taken to court for issuing scurrilous literature, namely D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, which contained 4-letter words. I think that's where that term was found useful. So John Robinson was this sort of radical bishop who was sort of well known about. He was on Any Questions on Friday evenings on the radio and things like that, as indeed was Donald Soper and some of the others. I once was invited to a meeting of Christian Action Council. They met in St. Paul, the chapter house of St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, this is not a beautiful circular Gothic room. It is a mansion designed by Sir Christopher Wren, and a very fine building too. You probably won't get into that place for any other reason, but there's a very large conference room, so it was very interesting to go into it. And on this occasion, there was Lord MacLeod. He had been ennobled and is a member of the House of Lords, but many years before, he had gone to Iona and run a project to restore the church at Iona and set up the Iona community. So this is a sort of activism which John Collins noted and took a note, wanted to have this kind of experience present.
Patsy.
Yeah, could you tell us what made you decide to be a Quaker, Jeffrey?
Oh, well, it's a rather curious story. I did a job on site, on a building site at Thamesmead, in South London, and I was setting out engineer. I was setting out complicated structures, and these were all built, and eventually it became Thamesmead, which was a model housing estate. However, one day, this meant I was in Wellington boots all the time because it was very muddy all the time, because it was winter. One day I'd got some blisters on my feet, and I thought, I'm best not go to wear boots today. So I suddenly struck up the idea of phoning in saying I had to have a day off sick. I didn't often do that. I didn't really do that. It didn't seem quite right somehow, unless you really were sick. Anyway, by lunchtime, my blisters had nearly gone, and I didn't have to wear boots. So I put my shoes on and went up to town for a stroll around. Now, and then I suddenly thought, I've heard of Quakers. I'll find out where a friend's house is. You've got to remember, or where Quakers hide out, rather, because there wasn't an internet. So I don't know, you went to the public library and found out something like that, I suppose, or you looked in the phone book. Anyway, that got me to a friend's house on Euston Road, opposite Euston Station. And then there was a bookshop. So I went into the bookshop, up those steps into the bookshop, and I came across a little book called Introducing Quakers by George Gorman. So I bought this, went off home. I couldn't put it down, and I finished it before I went to bed on Friday evening, and I decided I'd go to a Quaker meeting. However, I didn't know where to go for a Quaker meeting, so I went back to a friend's house, where I was pleased to find that there was a Quaker meeting at a friend's house. But of course, it's nothing to do with the building. That they are as friends who live in Euston and South Hampstead. And so I went to my first Quaker meeting, and that was in the small meeting house. Now it's very different now, the small meeting house. It's been chopped up into two pieces, a lower part and an upper part. The upper part is still a big meeting room. Anyway, that's where I went to, and I sort of never stopped going after that. The first time, an old lady stood up and she prayed to God, "Dear Father, like I guess she did every night." But other people there were quite humanist, really. And now's not the time to talk about them. Just to go on a bit from that, within 2 years, I'd become a member, but then I moved to East London, all related to Christian Action and Bethnal Green things. So I moved my membership to Ratcliffe Meeting, which happened to meet in Toynbee Hall, which is just east of the city. Ratcliffe, of course, was a long way east of that, but in about 1930, its meeting house fell down, so they had to go somewhere else. And by 1960 something, Walter Birmingham was a member of Ratcliffe Meeting, and he was the warden of Toynbee Hall. which was called the Universities Settlement in East London. And the universities are obviously, it's totally obvious that that could only mean Oxford and Cambridge, because other universities are poorer things, really. And the idea was to get people to go, and posh people, to see what it's like to live in the East End. They were only about 100 yards into the East End, but it was still the East End, and its postcode is E1. So I started going to meeting there, and I stayed there for about 30 years.
Do you think, Jeffrey, there's any future of communal housing and of such within London today, or is it something which has passed, as the version goes, past its sell-by date?
Well, community living is as old as the hills, really. Most of it was done in religious settings. Well, ours was in a way, but mostly it was done in monastic settings, which of course included nunneries. So they were all single-sex establishments mostly, and you had to take up calling to go into them. There were similar things slightly like that by churches out in the community. I think St. Catherine's in East London is that. And there are other things like that where people live together and eat at a common table in the evening, have a little cell as a room, and they go out into the big wide world and improve the big wide world, really, by their presence. Thinking later on, nowadays, of course, there's lots of communal living. It's in the shape of student houses, some of which have a shared kitchen. So there's lots of it around. There's probably 100 or so in Bristol alone, I suppose, of that sort. But it's not really an intentional community. They just found it convenient and congenial and convivial for 1, 2, or 3 years. Anything beyond that now becomes a much bigger question. Going back a few decades, there were when I lived in community, we got to know other communities. For instance, we got to know one in Gloucestershire, and they were founded in World War II because they were all they were conscientious objectors, and they agreed to do alternative service, namely farming. So they got so liked doing farming so much that after the war they obtained some land just up the hill from Gloucester and formed a community there, each in a very small house that they met together. And I got to know them a little bit. Then they no longer exist. There were people there who had been in Eric Gill's community in the 1920s in South Wales, in the Black Mountains. Eric Gill, of course, was the letter cutter and artist and sculptor who, on the one hand, devised typefaces, which are modern for the first time. That was in about 1920 something. There was somebody I met in Gloucester who had learnt these things from Eric Gill. Eric Gill was also good at carving. He had been commissioned to carve reliefs on the new BBC headquarters in Great Portland Place in about 1928 or 30. This is entirely off the subject, by the way, and what I'm now going to tell you is even further off the subject. He had rather novel sexual predilections, and lo and behold, a lot of these sculptures had rather large genitalia. And Lord Reith, who was head of the BBC, told a chap to get on a ladder and go up and reduce the size of the genitalia. I'm sorry about this, friends. It's not a very Quakerly subject at all.
Well, no, it's amusing when I see it has amused a number of friends. But the community which I remember which was talking about cluster. There was one in Stroud, which was called Whiteways, which I don't know if you'd have heard of, but it was quite a remarkable little place because it was run by a group, a community group who built a community house within there, and the deeds of the place were ritually burnt so that no one would know who owned the place. So it became a kind of a community place in name as well.
This sounds like a subject of a novel by Iris Murdoch.
It's fascinating to hear so many names that I recognize and so many organizations that I've heard of spoken about in one narrative, and to sort of start to imagine the connections and the strands and the threads that brought things together. You were mentioning that climate change wasn't understood well in the 70s, but of course that's when the Limits to Growth report came out, and Silent Spring. So there was a dawning environmental awareness in that time. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because I'm thinking that, you know, we're in a very chaotic time now. We have a incredibly unstable economy, many intersecting crises, and we obviously have a need for organized and connected political action and social action and climate action. I wonder whether there's scope. A tiny bit of background. Just after COP26, I saw a film which I can recommend to anybody called Black Oil on iPlayer. And it explains really clearly how deep our nation's commitment is to oil and to making all the money possible from it. It mentioned at one point that the stocks and shares in the London Stock Exchange are enough to guarantee 3.5 degrees of global warming, and we're wanting to limit it to 1.5. So it's like, how can we organize the new and Marvin, our mayor's point is, you won't get climate action from countries, you'll get it from cities. So, you know, could we have a network of social action starting in our cities and bringing together what's figuring out what's needed and then making it happen?
Well, that's probably a subject for another occasion.
But
very important as it is, you're right, David. I mean, people knew about the climate issues, but carbon in the atmosphere wasn't known in the same way, I don't think. But using, I mean, the worry seemed to be using up the world's resources and how we could avoid that. And that's one of the reasons some of us lived in community, so that we shared things more. And in particular, the pleasure was to share a washing machine. So although it's a fiendish modern device, it's a very labour-saving device. And I don't think each of us would have had a washing machine otherwise in the 1970s.
Yeah, in the 1970s, you went to the laundrette once a week.
Yes, I still do if the washing machine breaks down.
But the laundrette near my house is always full of people.
Yes,
young people with not many resources, possibly also homeless people.
There are far fewer laundrettes than there used to be, of course, aren't there? Does anyone want to know who the Labour politician was? Who was foreign minister in the Attlee government and devised the constitution of Western Germany, which is still in place, and left school at 13, brought up in a village in Somerset. There's recently been a biography of him by Andrew Adonis. Its title is Ernest Bevan,
wow.
Labour's Churchill.
Yeah.
And Ernest Bevan, apparently his first job was selling fizzy drinks around the docks in Bristol. His second job was being a trade union organiser. And by World War II, he was the key person in the cabinet who had organised all the nation's social help, because once you're at war, socialism is a good idea, and looking after each other and the state doing it is a good idea. And let's have lots and lots of British restaurants where you can go for your breakfast if your house is bombed in the night, things like that. Ernest Bevan set all that up. And after World War II, he became, there was an election, and surprise, surprise, Mr. Churchill, the Conservatives, did not win that election. The Labour won the election. There were no opinion polls in those days, so it was a total surprise the next morning. And Clement Attlee was Prime Minister. His Chancellor was Sir Stafford Cripps, who was a radical Christian. I don't know quite much more about him. I think he died in the early 1950s. I just remember the name from the news summaries on the radio. It sounded a very strange, frightening name, Sir Stafford Cripps, worthy of Dickens, really. Anyway, yes, so Ernest Bevan became foreign minister in the Labour government. The United States wasn't too bothered, didn't know how to re-establish Europe. So I'm learning this from Andrew Adonish's book, and this was America. The USA didn't know how to handle Europe; they didn't get a clue really. So they left it to Britain to come up as the senior Allied country to devise a constitution for West Germany. And Ernest Bevan was the man. I think he'd learnt it because he apparently travelled a great deal as a trade unionist in the 1920s and 30s. He'd been to America more than once, which was quite a big thing in those days. Mm. Anyway, he's nothing to do with Christian Action, but he obviously sat at the same table in Downing Street as Sir Stafford Cripps, who was something to do with Christian Action.
On Christian Action. Oh, sorry, Graham. Do carry on, my friend.
I just wanted to add to what Jeffrey has said. Bristol has quite a reputation for radical ideas and radical people who later became national figures. And two of the national figures that Jeffrey has mentioned have origins in Bristol. Stafford Cripps was Labour MP for Bristol South. Oh. I heard him preach in St Mary Redcliffe. So he started off had time in Bristol. And John Robinson, Bishop John Robinson, was a priest in Bristol in the early part of his ministry. I wanted to ask you, Jeffrey, more about the Canon Collins Educational and Legal Fund and the influence this had in breaking down apartheid in South Africa. Mm-hmm. I'll just add that Margaret Simpson of Bedminster Meeting is very keen on supporting this. We raised money for it for several years.
Well, I only heard indirectly about this. There were two women each called Phyllis in Newgate Street who ran it. And nobody could work out how it was run. Significant amount of money was transmitted to South Africa to people who were on trial for apartheid offences and their families. And when they got sent to prison, it was even more for their families. So this, it seems that this all started in the sometime in the 50s or early 60s, I think. It was called International Defence and Aid Fund. And that's about as much as I knew about it in those days, except that when they came and looked at Eastbourne House, they said, we can't go and live there. we can't go and work there because we don't want to be on a ground floor, because they'd already had boss people, agents, infiltrating their offices and their staff and climbing their drain pipes to try and find out how all this money got to South Africa. And it was big money, because I understand the government of Sweden was sending $500,000 a year through this to South Africa and people in South Africa. So Boss was right, as it were, in their terms, to be worried, because it wasn't just the odd £5 that was getting through at all. It was really big money. And a Western government using this organization to send it. Anyway, about 20 years later, in the Observer on one Sunday, there was a big article, and it told you how this had happened. And I don't remember the exact details, but basically anybody wanting to donate to help a South African family, it was something like this. They had to go to the Barclays Bank nearby. They were given an account number and a sort code, which and said, put your money in this. So they put their money in that. And then somebody in South Africa went to that bank in South Africa and withdrew the same amount and passed it on to the family in need, or the person in need. And this happened for 20 years at least, and the state security services couldn't crack it. And so I learnt all that from an article in the Observer about 20 or 30 years ago. So I don't know if that adds a bit to your answers you a little bit, Graham. As I say, I wasn't particularly closely involved with that.
I think Hattie wanted to know the name of the fund.
Oh, well, I think it was called International Defence and Aid, but it's probably morphed into something a bit different now. I'm almost sure it exists, but I think it's morphed into something more appropriate for nowadays.
And I suppose my question would be, does Christian Action still survive or not?
No, sadly, it doesn't survive. It closed about 30 years ago. Basically, Colin might have become John Collins' successor, but I don't know. I'm not going. You might have noticed, apart from John Collins and people whose names are in the Dictionary of National Biography, I haven't mentioned any full names really, and I'm not going to now. But it won't be it's not unknown in history for some sort of sexual entanglement to cause a crisis, and this was something on those lines. So Canon Collins failed to find a successor. I could name several other regular church people who he had looked at, who were interested, but and had potential, but none of them quite wanted to take it on. And I think in a way it was a thing of the times. And also it's an organization with a leader and a figurehead. And that's what frequently organizations are. It's rather unusual for organizations not to quite have a figurehead. But you can think of, say, anti-apartheid, which is now all around the world. And one of the founders of that was a Quaker. And in a way, the other probably thought we've got to have a Quaker-like setup and not have a figurehead. But yes, comparing things to the present day is a very different thing, really. I mean, it was much more like the 19th century than the 21st century in those days.
Any other comments or questions, friends? Then Hattie.
I just think it's very inspirational to hear about what people have done, and I do think that one's younger life experiences definitely influence attitude later on, and give you a belief in yourself that you can do things. So I think it's really important to celebrate, you know, how we've been introduced to all sorts of life experiences, and try and engage with younger people, and try to highlight that, and see if you can give them those sort of experiences somehow. So thank you.
Thank you.
If you, on this vein, 6 months ago, I was approached by a friend, Dave, who had helped on the first Open Christmas and the subsequent ones. The first one was in the crypt of St. George in the East, which is in Stepney, and a wonderful church designed by a wonderful steeple house designed by Nicholas Hawksmoor. It got bombed in World War II, and they rebuilt it, kept the shell, and the crypt was very fine and large, and that's where the first Open Christmas was. Anyway, David, who I knew then, was 18-year-old. His dad lent him the car, and Dave lent me his car. So at the end of each day of the Open Christmas, there were a group of people who really didn't want to sleep on the floor. These are Quakers. So I offered to take them home to different parts of London in David's dad's estate car. So I started to learn my way around London at sort of 1 a.m. on the day after Boxing Day and things like that. Anyway, David came back to me. He's not a Quaker, although he was brought up as a Quaker in a North London Quaker children's meeting. And he was very amusing, really, because friends there said that we're meeting in God's presence and God is with us. And David started looking around all around the room, looking in the corners and saying, I'm trying to find God. He is a sort of 14-year-old. He was playing a joke on the meeting. Well, I suppose they got the drift of it. Anyway, David didn't go to university or anything like that, but eventually he became worked with a FOIA organisation, and then he became a magistrate or the youth bench, on the youth bench or something, and he ended up as chairman of the magistrates in East London, which of course is a notorious place for things, for people appearing in the magistrates' court. So it was very pleasant to get to know him. Anyway, he'd met somebody from Quaker Social Action, which is basically in Bethnal Green, the aforementioned, and East London mainly. It does lots of other things, like helping people with funerals, poor people with funerals, and all kinds of other things. Anyway, he said Quaker Homeless Action became the umbrella body that ran Open Christmases. It was London Quaker Action Group, which had been influenced by our friend from Philadelphia meeting, George Lakey, who was on an exchange in about 1972, 73, and who came to yearly meeting about 5 years ago in Britain. Anyway, David said, would I help him write an article about the first Open Christmases? So I did that, and it's now on the website of Quaker Social Action. So if you look up Quaker Social Action, you see an article by myself and David Chesterton describing the first Open Christmases. And soon after that, the GLC organised Open Christmases. They found warehouses. And after that, Crisis of Christmas opened Open Christmases. Previously, on Christmas Day, you could walk along to there and get a Christmas lunch. We thought, London Quaker Action Group, inspired by a priest in Scandinavia thought that we wanted a free regime for rough sleepers and not one where they were looked down upon, even if they did still get a Christmas dinner. So we provided accommodation overnight. It was a place to sleep overnight in a heated room and food for the time. And after the second one, there was a woman there. I could tell you her name, but I won't. She admitted that she was sent from Crisis at Christmas to learn how to do it. So after that, Crisis at Christmas ran open Christmases, and also the GLC did, and other bodies do. So it's no longer particularly notable when people look after, when rough sleepers get put up overnight at Christmas. Of course, this is one of the wonderful things about Central Meeting, that the meeting house was offered to rough sleepers 365 nights a year. So I thought this was the way to go. And of course, they'd be there now if the government wasn't putting them up in hotels. And I gather that still happens. So jolly good thing too.
Right, Prince. I think that the hour has come upon us, and it is time for us to go forth and do our own things on a Friday. So thank you very much for coming to this meeting, and we hope to see you again. And the next thing which we are going to be, which will interest us, with is Helen Gamza, who's going to talk on stitching for survival and other craftist plots.
Great.
I think.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you.
Right, thank you all.
Thank